Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. A heartfelt welcome to the presentation of the financial and operating results of the PGE Group after the first half of the year of 2019. First half of the year, even though the weather shows that it's way lower, but for significant reasons we had to postpone it, which will be discussed later on. And traditionally, we will deliver the presentation and then we'll hold a Q&A session. Traditionally, we'll give over the floor to the room guests in our room first. Thanks for turning up. Then you can ask the questions online. Traditionally, if they recur, I won't be reading them. If those questions go beyond our time frame, we will address them in the written form. So without further ado, let me present the gentleman at the table, Mr. Ryszard Wasiłek, Vice President for CEO, and Emil Wojtowicz, CFO. My name is Kuba Frejlich, Investor Relations. Over to you, gentlemen. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Due to the position I occupy, I would like to tell you share some operating issues connected with the functioning of PGE Group. We'll start with a slide you are aware of. Those data were published yesterday, and the figures presented there are, you should be familiar with them. The first half of the year was ended with an EBITDA of 4.4 billion, net profit 1.8 billion. Looking at what happened in Q2, you can see the green figures as compared to the previous year. Very significant, but the details will be shared with you by Mr. Emil Wojtowicz. Where those very good group results stem from, I will focus on the operating items. In the first half of the year, the generation was of 29, better than in the previous year, distribution 18, so pretty much what we delivered last year over the same time frame. Retail sales 28 petajoules, minus 1% vis-a-vis the previous year, and I will discuss it later on. Q2 was characterized by, in terms of the heat cells, that they were much higher than expected. This stems from a slightly colder turn of May. Usually temperatures tend to be higher at that time, contrary to the previous years. The heat cells were much higher in energy. In terms of G in Q2 was 13.9 terawatt hours, 9% lower than in the previous year. As regards the structure, it's important to say what you can see on the slide. The situation is in the national power system, which is important. Once we get acquainted with the situation in the national power system, it will be easier to get to PGE Group, even though we represent a very high share in the generation and distribution, both of district heat and power. This is important. So on a year-on-year basis, as you can see, the change in energy consumption was of 0%, so practically nothing much changed in terms of the consumption, but which is very important from our point of view, not only our point of view. Wind generation changed, that's 1.5 terawatt hours more than in the prior year, and the imports by 0.8, and these two elements are very crucial, and then they translate into how the entire group functions and how we generate, especially in conventional energy, what the production is. In terms of the wind, I will tell you later on about this, also owing to having quite large eolic resources, we also benefit from that. 10% was the factor by which the generation was larger than in the prior year, which is split in terms of lignite 12%, hard coal 15%, and in the remaining ones 15% more. As we look at the other elements in terms of wind, 28% more than in the previous year, which shows that the impact countrywide of 1.5 terawatt hours also translates into our windmills. So we have 550 of power active in wind farms. Natural gas was neutral in the first semester. Of course, it will be slightly different for the last quarter. I will tell you more about it. Talking about the colder April and May, and all our cogeneration plants are gas-fired. Pumped storage, much more than expected vis-a-vis the previous year. Wind, 28 hours, 28%. That's very favorable weather conditions caused that. We had a much better energy output from the resources we had. Biomass 14%. That's also a very good element. In this slide, we're not showing this because you can see it in the small print. 0.03 terawatt hours. We commissioned the waste incineration plant in Rzeszów, and this is the element connected with the energy obtained from that installation in Rzeszów. In Q2 we had a similar situation when it comes to district heat. It was quite untypical as compared to the prior year. In Q2 only, as regards the production of 9%, it's 9% less lignite, 13% less hard coal, 7% less, and 11% in natural gas. Wind 8% better because the favorable weather conditions were rather in Q1 than in Q2. This translates in terms of hard coal. There's 28 megawatts in Bełchatów, Turów less, 32 in Turów. This was also impacted by the time devoted to overhauls in lignite. That's 1.9 thousand hours more in Bełchatów and 250 hours in Turów. In terms of hard coal, we also had a smaller load factor in Opole, minus 45 megawatt hours. We're talking about units 1 to 4 because we'll still be talking about the newer units, but it was also impacted by the larger number of hours spent on overhauls in Opole, over 3,000, and the standby in reserves in Dolna Odra. That's a power plant that has special contracts with PSE, and the reserve standby was much higher on a year-on-year basis. It's plus 2.8 thousand hours, which also impacted the generation based on hard coal. All the other arrows are green, so everything that involves natural gas, wind, and pumped storage, which worked much better than we expected, both in terms of planning and on a year-on-year basis. Now, a couple of slides about our investments and their status, as well as their impact on the current relationships in terms of generation. Our flagship project connected with Opole is almost finished. We're finishing Unit 5 and 6. Unit 5 was commissioned on the 31st of May. We're up and running. 900 megawatts are up and running in Opole. Unit 6 will be working hopefully as of September the 30th, so actually on Monday. the monthly or 720 hour continuous work period is coming to an end. Since it's been going on without any disturbances, then Monday the 30th is also the time when Unit 6 will also be commissioned. So in Opole we'll have an extra 160 megawatt hours extra, given the efficiencies which are much higher than efficient because it's overcritical. So the efficiency will be much higher, the emissions will be much lower, and because they will be working on a non-stop basis, so the new capacities in Opole will mean that our competitive advantage will be much higher in that locality. To wrap it up in Opole, we're talking about September the 30th and May the 31st have been met, so hopefully the units which are we'll still be working on them, because there are some issues that cause for the consortium to still stay with us on the construction site after September the 30th, but those units are up and running. Well, there are always some minor issues in such situations which does not pose any threat to the availability of those units. The Turów project, after the new appendix, should be commissioned in October next year, and this is the new deadline which factors in the new waste treatment plant. Now it's going without any disturbances. Of course, as in every construction site, there are some minor issues, but I think that the consortium, we have another meeting on Monday with TACO, so some of the issues will be taken. So as of today, we're not declaring any changes with regard to commissioning that unit in October 2020. On September the 19th, the applied voltage was applied of 110 kilowatts, so we can start the intensive startup phase of individual devices, so that at the turn of next year we could start the combustion of the unit boiler. So all the devices and first of all the unit could be checked for the efficiency of its execution, as well as all the elements, and there are thousands of such elements, so I don't think that those deadlines are under any threat, and October next year will be a deadline to be met. Now, a couple of slides about how PGE Group is transforming, how we are learning our lessons with regard to CO2 prices, which we don't expect to fall. The recent volatility has stabilized, hence our decision to adjust its assets to the situation that we're facing. Hence the slides which we will be showing you later on show you how the group intends to work going forward in the near future. The first one is the cluster project after the recent act of law. That's a major project of about 9 megawatts. It's pretty much advanced right now. The information that you have here testify to the fact that also the deadline contemplated for Q1 2020 will be met, because the rate of assembly of those windmills is satisfactory enough for us, so much so that we believe that both the deadline will be met as well as the new 90 megawatts will increase our capacity in wind generation by another 100 megawatts. All the other elements connected with assembly, all the access roads, all the supply is performed. The line of 110 kW is about 40 kilometers. It will be performed by the end of the year. So the moment it's when we launch the project cluster, because it's composed of several locations, we will be able to do it after Q1 2020. That's the first element of that element. And the second element, we want to be the leader of development in photovoltaic plants. Our plans are very ambitious, since we're all aware of the energy policy project by 2040, and we wish to comply with the assumptions of PEP 2040. Our ambitions are that out of these 10.2 gigawatts, we should have 5% of the power contemplated therein. So we will be talking about 2,500 megawatts. As of today, that project was launched in spring. Since so far we approached this problem in a slightly different way. Now we've changed our policy altogether, and we've decided that this was a very important project, hence our determination to accomplish it by 2030. Recently, we also informed you about this. We concluded several contracts with PGE H1, with PKP Polish Rail, and we also have some letters of intent prepared with the next owners of large land, because to build 2.5 megawatts in wind, you have to multiply it by 2. You need 2 hectares per 1 megawatt in photovoltaics. So we have to have very large areas of land under control. So this project is pretty much advanced, and we expect the next investment projects next year. As of today, actually 750 megawatts. So the land that we've checked for urban or rural planning, possibilities of applying supply, of providing supply. These are the pieces of lands that will allow us to perform the works, because that land already meets the requirements. We're working on the next ones, and this is a project which will be still very much operated by us, and we can see the opportunities of development in our group of PV power plants. 2,500 megawatts, that's really a lot. Apart from the investments in PV farms, we're also learning our lessons, as I said before, from the very high CO2 prices. Hence, we decided to build 2 new gas units in Dolna Odra, which is a location very close to Świnoujście, and the new outlet of the Baltic pipe. Hence, the decision to locate both gas units in Dolna Odra. Dolna Odra, as I said, it has special units with the national power system, so we believe that those units will also meet that role. Except for the role contemplated for us, it will be a backup vis-a-vis the development of the PV farms. And the situation as of today is that we've launched a tender. We expect the bids in October, and we expect that by the end of the year we will be able to choose the partner to build that power plant. Also, by the end of December, we will also submit those 2 units for the auction. any contracts connected with the connection with the national power system, connected with the gas connection, are almost finished today. The GK supervisory board is making the decision on approving. Thus, we're talking about 60 kilometers of gas supply, between also. That's a huge investment to us and to gas systems. So hopefully we will be able to commission them by the 1st of January 2024. Other than this major gas investment, the group will also be involved in slightly smaller gas-related investments. Among the largest ones, it's Czechnica, a total shift from hard coal to gas. Czechnica is near Wrocław, and also in Gdynia, Kraków-Zgierz, Kielce-Bydgoszcz. These are the locations where you need to, if you need to replace the current coal-fired plants into some elements connected with the finishing of the operations. That's the moment when we switch to natural gas, and the locations I mentioned are examples of where such transformation from coal to gas will be performed, and those projects are very much advanced after the corporate approvals. The next project is the offshore project. This is also a very important project for us, so much so that we've incorporated a separate PGE Baltica company, which directly reports to PGE Group rather than PGEEO, because it's a very important project for us. And from this point of view, we wanted to make sure that we can directly supervise the offshore project. This is a project, as of today, we have 3 islands, Baltica 1, 2, and 3. We are starting it reversely from Baltica 3, then 2, then 1. And as of today, in terms of power, we'll be talking about 124 megawatts in Baltica, about 900, and in Baltica 1, about it's 1,000, 1,500, and 900, all in all, about 3,500 of offshore megawatts, 1,000 megawatts. So we're talking, that's not over, because we're still contemplating an even greater growth of the offshore project on the Baltic Sea. Since this is a thing where we decided to cooperate with an external partner, as you will know, we've also launched, announced this need and invited the major companies with the largest potential, and out of them we've chosen 4 that have submitted initial bids. Those 4 companies have submitted binding bids. We've received them already, and we believe that by the end of the year we'll also choose the partner for the first project connected with Baltica 3. And the period between submitting the bid and the year-end seems to be long, but it's short in fact, because those bids contain many elements, and you have to analyze them on an in-depth basis to make a very prospective choice of a partner for the projects we wish to accomplish, and they are not small. An additional element, which also shows the direction in which PGE Group is changing. This is the establishment of the Fizen Eco Investments with 3 business lines. As you can see, it's PGE, Energia Ciepła, PGE, and PGE Energia Odnawialna Renewable Energies. This project has been launched already. We expect 1.5 billion in terms of the target value of the fund, and it will be used for all the environmental projects. And we also believe that this is one of the new elements in our strategy to use the resources only for those projects which are aligned to the transformation of the company in another direction than it was functioning so far. And the last element that I wanted to tell you about is grid grounding. Of course, in terms of the grid grounding, we're talking about such works connected with better SAIDI-SAIFI. We've been involved in this for years. However, this slide shows that we wanted to wrap it up. We wanted to have about 20% of the voltage to be grounded. Right now, our ambition is to have 30%. We wish to achieve 30% by 2023, which will allow us to improve SAIDI-SAIFI, those quality ratios that impact the comfort of power received by our 5 million recipients. We believe that this program, since the worth of the program definitely exceeds 1 billion, we've also decided that it was one of our mega capex projects, and we've also created an appropriate structure because we believe that the comfort of our recipients is very important, and we wish to oversee this project in a special way. So to achieve the goal of 30%, we believe that our activities are necessary, and the rate has been given to this project, this propulsion. At this moment, we're at the stage of analyzing it on a very broad basis, because to analyze this program we need a lot of building permits in various places, and this is all underway. In each distribution office this project is underway, and we believe to be able to accomplish this in line with the assumptions contemplated so far. This is 1.9 billion more than previously assumed of the 25% grid grounding, and all of this will be put in the tariffs if the president of the ERO thinks it proper. That's all from me. If you have any questions after the presentation from Emil, I'm ready to take any questions. Over to you. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Well, I think everything has been said already, so we can pass on to the Q&A session already. But since I'm here, I'll tell you a couple of things. The COO has already wrapped up the developments in the market, or actually what has happened to the system. Let me wrap it up with one more sentence. As we will remember, in Q1 the consumption was lower, however it was very windy, so we derived half of the energy from windmills. In Q2 the consumption was much higher, so it's almost neutral for H1. However, in Q2 a large amount of energy was derived from imports. We can see the red curve much higher than the blue curve. The red curve is the domestic consumption, and the blue curve is the total generation, imports plus exports, if conversely. This is very important because I'm just explaining what Richard was talking about, how it impacts the generation volume, the volume of the energy generated by us, which also impacts on our financial results. As regards the market situation, the market prices, you can see that both the quarter and the semester was quite stable. There were no such major changes or increases as in the previous year. The average forward price for the next year is of about 270 zlotys. One of the main reasons being that the CO2 prices did not change all that much. They are pretty much stable, although their level is rather high. However, if we take a look at the spot prices, which respond to various changes in the system even more, we notice one thing, that those changes on a year-on-year basis, so that's Q2 compared to Q2 of the previous year, or the same exercise for the entire semesters, indicate that the energy price has grown less than indicated by the CO2 price. So it's not the entire increase in the CO2 price as the cost factor have been translated into the spot energy prices, which is one of the factors causing this in Q2 was higher imports, and in Q1 a higher wind generation. Passing on to the financials, let me start with the reported EBITDA. For Q2, that was 2.5 billion in the previous year. For Q2, that was 1.5 billion zlotys. For the semester, 4.4. In the previous year, 3.7. One of the better results for these results were one-offs. Let me mention two of them. One of them being the additional CO2 entitlements, emissions to CO2 emissions, the worth being 1.4 billion, which increased EBITDA mostly in the generation segment and slightly in district heating. And next one-off was changing in the provision this year. It was to the minus on 230 million. This change was caused by a change in the market rates, because the provision very much depends on the market rates through the discounting mechanisms of future expenditure. If today we expect next expenditure to recultivate the post-mining land, each change of the discount rate means that the provision changes its value a lot. Passing on to the recurring EBITDA, 1.4 billion for Q2 and 3.3 billion for the entire half of the year. For the half of the year, it's half a billion less than in the prior year. And here on the recurring activity. Let me quote three factors that impacted such results to the greatest degree. About 200 million was due to the lack of revenues due to the support to cogeneration. This year, indeed, we did not recognize any such revenues. We believe that in Q2 or in the second semester or in Q3, we will be able to recognize such revenues once the appropriate regulations are in place. The second element, a smaller result in the trade, in trading power, that's about 220, 230. And the third element, higher personnel costs, about 180 million. That entire amount does not correspond to the amount actually disbursed. It also includes some provisions, this time actuarial provisions. A couple of words about what impacted our most important segments. For generation, we can see the increase in the prices, also the increase in CO2 prices as well as coal. These factors, even despite the lower generation, meant that the lower output meant that the generation margin was roughly the same, and hence recurring EBITDA for the generation was maintained for H1 at the level of 1.3 billion. For district heating, we will remember that the costs are not entirely translated in the tariff for district heating. However, owing to the higher energy prices, the total revenues for heat and electricity have allowed us to again obtain the same margin, and the EBITDA result would be probably similar if the revenues due to yellow and red certificates had been similar. In terms of distribution, we had a slightly higher volume and slightly higher revenues, but also higher costs due to electricity to cover the balancing losses. So these two factors actually neutralized each other. Higher personnel costs was the factor which caused for the EBITDA on distribution to drop to 1.2 billion vis-a-vis 1.3 billion in the previous year. Let me also draw attention to the fact that since the beginning of Q1, our indebtedness dropped by 1 billion zlotys, which was caused by the fact that today we are buying more CO2 in forward transactions rather than based on spot transactions. Hence, the expenditure is less. At this moment, our indebtedness amounts to 11 billion zlotys, which gives us an EBITDA, debt to EBITDA ratio of 1.55. And in terms of recurring EBITDA, it's 1.8. It's probably worth mentioning that due to the fact that the startup phase of Opole, also the expenditure on Opole on that project is almost finished. However, we are already obtaining some revenues and earning margins, although part of it can be seen in the revenues and part of it is recognized as a reduction in the expenditure, but on a cash basis, both of those units contributed to about 140 million in margin. That's a repetition of what I discussed in a different form. The higher revenues due to energy owing to higher prices have allowed us to cover higher both CO2 emissions as well as fuel. All in all, in all the three segments generating energy, the impact is of plus 153 million. I've also mentioned the margin in the energy market. I've also mentioned the support for cogeneration. And let me only repeat, in terms of the personnel costs, the personnel costs have grown in total by 186 million, whereof about 120 is derivative of the actual disbursements, so salaries and the like, and the rest of it is connected with the provisions connected with our employees. A couple of words on the availability of our generation assets. In terms of hard coal, the availability was slightly less than in the previous year. The overhaul of unit number 2 in Bełchatów triggered that, and the power utilization ratio was much less. Why? We've mentioned that already. Our power plants are significantly less used by the system. Firstly, because of the higher windiness, and secondly, owing to the higher imports. And secondly, by how the operator operates the grid. In terms of hard coal availability and energy utilization was lower. There was the overhaul of unit number 2. In the ratios you can see here, you don't see the generation of unit 5 and 6, so probably if they were here, then the results would be, the figures would have been different. You can say that the generation from the older units in Opole 1 and 4 have been taken over by the startup and testing work of the new units. In terms of the eolic assets, we know that first of all in Q1 it was more windy, hence the higher capacity factor. However, a lower availability owing to the scheduling of the overhauls. In terms of the distribution, what it looked like, as we will remember, in the entire system it was balanced or slightly in the red. Our distribution shows a slight plus, about 1% or 0.8%. Network losses are being lowered on a stable basis. The SAIDI and SAIFI results mostly stem from what was happening in Q1 in March, and there the high parameters still translated into the values for the entire semester. Since there's work underway on changing the model for requiring quality from the operators, we expect that such events will be excluded from the measurement of such ratios. The connection time dropped below 200 days again, and in this way we are meeting the required ratios, the regulator's targets. In terms of CapEx, the three main items, 30% each, roughly, it's 30% for the development of generation, that's Opole and Turów, 30% for the existing assets, renewals of existing assets, and 30% for distribution. What was mentioned by Richard about the cluster will be probably visible in the second half of the year. These data, or this graph, maybe does not convey the development of the work so much. It's rather about the advancement of the payments. So in distribution, we spent more this year on distribution than previously, owing to the expenditure, the fact that the distribution's expenditure conditioning the time when you can perform the work in the field. And as usual, the forward-looking slide, the outlook for the half of the year, which is still 3 and almost a half months to go. For conventional generation, we believe that the reported EBITDA will be higher. We still remember that one of the main important reasons, is to include the additional CO2 allowances, and we notice how our generation assets are being used, and this might exert some pressure on our results. If it's not this year, then perhaps next year. In terms of district heating, there are two effects that roughly neutralize each other. Is the fact that there will be no such support level for cogeneration as in the previous year. So the recurrent factor decreasing the EBITDA. However, inclusion of such assets impacting the cogeneration. These two factors will roughly neutralize each other and mean that the reported EBITDA for district heating should be on a stable level. In terms of renewables, we will remember that Q1 was good in terms of the windiness. The high prices of energy also support the results of this segment. Here we expect better results than in the previous year, and there were probably no major one-offs. In terms of supply, we expect a better result than in the previous year. The process connected with defining the parameters is practically finished. For distribution, what we can see, that's what we mentioned, or I mentioned, the higher operating costs will probably cause, or continuing them throughout the second semester will probably mean that the result for this segment will be lower than what we achieved in 2018. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your presentation, ladies and gentlemen. Over to you, first of all. So, any questions? Paweł. Good morning. So let's start with a curiosity. There was a slide showing the offshore projects. What sort of a price per megawatt hour are you talking about? What do you want to achieve in your offshore projects? At this moment, we're trying out various price models. You will be aware that at this moment, work is underway on the legislation to support offshore projects. It's hard to treat that law as a foregone conclusion before it's even finished. But however, we are applying various scenarios. Is there any minimum price below which you will determine that those projects are not worth investing in? As per the information obtained from Europe, perhaps not from the Baltic Sea Basin or catchment, we even see that in the UK you can continue investments and operations even without the support. So we believe that if we consider the work connected with the legislation, this will be a thing to make a difference for us, so much so that we will be able to deliver on this program. One more thing that we try to repeat over and over. The comparison between various systems can be slightly misleading, or the prices obtained under various systems can be misleading. Given, for instance, the fact that under the current regime, we will also be responsible for building the connection. So to put it straight, we will have to pay for the connection, which means a much higher capex. So it has to translate into a higher auction price under a regime where the operator pays for the connection. That money is not derived from nowhere. It's derived from the operator's tariff or price list, or from another bag, so to say. To paraphrase it, it's, if we're talking about apples and apples and oranges and oranges, We don't expect any other conditions because that's a scalable global technology to achieve a different levelized cost of electricity than in the case of the countries that have similar regulations in place. Thank you. I'm sorry, the question was off the mic. In January or in February, we showed you a presentation where we specifically did not provide any numbers. That's a sensitive legislative process, also among others. So, with your permission, we will not be commenting on the nominal prices quoted. Okay, if I may pass on to coal. I've checked your coal prices that you paid in the first semester of this year and the previous year. Actually, I don't think so. Maybe it was Q2. It was H2, Q2, and it turned out that your coal price increased by 28%. It might stem from my calculation error, but I would like to hear an official denial or otherwise. And PGE has just proudly announced that it's selling out its supplies and it will reach the minimum inventory. So I would like to hear what your inventories are at this moment, and what the target inventories at the end of the year. The contracts we conclude, especially with Jastrzębska Spółka Węglowa and PGG, are multiple year quotes. This situation cannot take in place. I'm talking about year-on-year things. Was it H1 on H1 or Q2 on Q2? It was year-on-year. I don't remember whether we were talking about the quarters or semesters. I think it might have stemmed from the coal firing structure, because we also import coals. And the situation that occurred between the end of last year and the beginning of this year, the windiness and so on, meant that we consumed less coal. So the structure between imported versus domestic coal might have changed, and hence you might have this impression. But the contracts are multi-annual contracts. And I don't think there has been any change stemming from any change in the needs. Those contracts are binding. In the case of Apollo units 5 and 6, we have a 20-year contract concluded back in 2014. Of course, it contains some elements connected with the current situation, inflation, and ARA markets. However, it's stable. And as regards, well, obviously, since what we show to you, and you've seen it, our generation based on hard coal and lignite was lower on a year-on-year basis. The situation has meant that we have much higher inventories than required by the chair of the ERO, and we're trying to meet the contracts with our domestic partners and to receive the coal contemplated in the contract, hence the higher inventory levels. However, by the end of the year, we expect to meet the requirements of those contracts, especially PGG and Jastrzębska Spółka Węglowa, so there should be no backlog there. I'm not sure if that price has been qualified. There's one presentation issue. Well, we have a contract, and we relate it to the cost per gigajoule, and we've advised you of this level also half a year ago. And what you calculated relates to the cost per ton. We were not capable of recalculating it, whether just so quickly, whether it's as much as 8 percentage points, because it stems from the structure. Well, the coal for cogeneration plants is much more calorific, but it's hard. Well, we expected the transport cost will be 20 plus, or roughly 20. So these several points probably stem from that. Whether it's as much as 8, well, it's hard to tell you right now. If I may ask you another question, what is the average price of CO2 realized, be it in Q2 or in H1? What is the CO2 price in your costs? Let me just explain why I'm asking. Because the profit of 1.4, well, that would imply the CO2 price of rightly 29 euro, if I'm calculating it well. And then the question is, well, there are two issues. One of them being about the additional allowances that had to be valued at market prices, and the second one is connected with our hedging instruments. So, so these are two totally different things. We obtained additional allowances in 2018, so they're measured at current value. What we have in our costs are valued at the moment when we bought them, whether it was a contract or a spot, obviously. However, if you recognized it at EBITDA at 29, won't it be the case that the next periods will be charged with the cost of 29, because that's how you recognized it? So that will be charging your cost, your OPEX. At this moment, I haven't been able to find right off what the average price is as charged to the cost, but let me just comment on the conclusion. Well, luckily not, because these are two different portfolios, so to say. The one that is appropriated to our own needs is the portfolio appropriated to our own needs, and it is measured at cost, and this is the trading portfolio, and it is measured at the current market value. So it's not that you can just put it from one portfolio to another to have higher or lower costs. Okay. Traditionally, we have slide 57 on CO2 and the costs attributed to the period, and there this stems from note 19 in the consolidated financial statements. The cost for the period is of 1.8 million. So that's what you're talking about, the costs ascribed to this stemming from the hedging policy. So that would imply 59 zlotys, depending on the FX rate, roughly 15 euro, including the free of charge. Well, just off my head, I should say 17 euro, which makes sense. Okay, one more question about heat, because you've increased the guidance to flat, but this guidance includes the one-off of 280 million in CO2 allowances. So I understand that the heat economy has decreased so much that you expect it to drop by 33% in terms of the EBITDA, 280 million versus 850, which you 350 that you reported last year. That stems from your slide. So the EBITDA decreased by 33% because that stems from the flat EBITDA, and we know that it's supported a lot by the one-off CO2 certificates, or am I wrong? Do I understand it in a wrong way? Well, let me rephrase it, perhaps. If we're talking about absolute figures, EBITDA will be roughly lower by the lack of support. Because the way I was trying to explain it, the total revenues from heat, which does not increase so much, and electricity allows you to cover the total coal cost and CO2 cost increase. However, the gap which cannot be covered is the lack of revenues from the certificates. However, the lack of revenues from certificates is a fixed phenomenon, and the lack of support is a one-off. Yes, we fully agree. So let's enjoy the strong performance in 2019. Well, for the outlook that we update each quarter, we've provided it with a negative guidance. We did it for a reason, and now we are showing you a flat guidance. Well, we've known the regulatory factors. Their quantification is something we've been aware of. We are still waiting for the next acts of law that will allow us to show how much we will be able to recognize in this year's results, which we are expecting. This is not included in this guidance. There's one more factor. We have a granddaughter company, the Wrocław cogeneration, which still receives support KDT, which is like a wager against the increase in energy. So if the energy prices increases, then that wager changes, and it changes in such a way that our future expectations for future compensations are verified in minus. So each quarter we have to translate the difference between the end of the KDT, that's in 2024, and the current expectations. So the accumulated difference is included in this year's, in the current results, and that's several dozen million, which also makes the result change. Thank you very much. If someone is asking any question, they're not using the mic, I'm sorry, I cannot hear the question. The question is whether a new compensation system will appear. That's between which lines? Because I didn't figure out. That's what are we talking about? District heating? Oh well, then we are waiting. The act of law is in place. We're waiting for the regulation, and for the existing assets it will not be as generous, it will not provide so much support as it was the case previously. And for the new ones, we will be calculating it on a case-by-case basis about how the support impacts the economies of investments in the next locations, but you cannot expect it to be as generous as the yellow and red certificates have been. For the existing assets, yes, you can say that again, that's true. And, well, since we've dwelt on district heating so much, one more question about 2020, because we know what the tariffs looks like in district heating right now. You had the low coal prices included in your prices. given that coal had been going up, can you expect that this trend will be reversing in 2020? So the more expensive coal will be included in the tariff, or in the next year? It should appear not only the coal prices but also CO2 prices, because we have to remember that in generation this is ratio based, and hence the delay. In the grids it's based on the costs, and then it's easier to include it. In the case of our locations, Gorzów and Toruń, where we have both generation and the district heating, it doesn't make any difference because it's one cost base. But in the other locations, Gdańsk, Kraków, Lublin, you're right, they are ratio based, and they come with a delay. And now we're involved in negotiations with the chair of the ERO through various industrial chambers to change that. So both for coal and CO2. So would you venture to say that 2019 was the value? Yes, definitely. The tariffs for 2020 will include the higher CO2 and coal prices. Thank you. We have no further questions from the floor. One more. He got an email from his head office. Okay, so let me come back to the last slide, on the first part about the grid grounding, and it was mentioned both about the capex of. I'll find it. Before you find it, 3.5 billion is the total cabling cost, including the value of the previously planned capex, and this 1.9 is the delta between the previously included 25 and 30%. So 1.9 is the delta. So is that today that you're talking about? Meaning to invest an additional 1.2, or have I missed something? Well, actually, we've been talking about it for roughly half a year, and today we're showing you this slide straightforwardly. Yes, 1.9 is an extra expenditure. At this moment, we're waiting for the development plan to be approved for the distribution. If approved, then these additional funds for grid grounding will be included in the distribution tariff. So we are comparing to what we talked about so far. That's an additional 2 billion. 2 billion. So we talked about roughly 1.8, now we'll be talking about 2.3, 2.2, 2.3. And most important question, what is your plan about the dividend payout next year? Obviously, it's still valid. It still applies. I mean, the dividend policy still applies. So we are planning on paying out, in line with that policy, we are planning to pay out from this year's profit. Next year we will be dispersing money depending on the investment plans and acquisition plans. Then, do you have any major acquisition plans in the Polish market or international markets that could disturb the expected dividend payout? It seems that, at least as of today, we have no plans that we haven't communicated so far. Thank you. before anyone else gets another email with questions to be asked. I was joking, obviously. This way, or rather, the conference has been extended a little bit. Thank you for your active involvement, and we invite you to another conference on the presentation of Q3 results.